The telegram arrived on a Tuesday, which was the same day Nora Dalloway's entire world collapsed. She was standing behind her flower stand on the main street of Caldwell, Kansas, in the summer of 1882, when Marshal Jude Keller came striding toward her with the kind of expression she had never seen on his face before. Not anger, not the flat, professional hardness he wore like armor most days. Something worse. Something raw and broken that she had no name for, because she had never imagined that man capable of it. He was holding the telegram in one hand and a fistful of wildflowers in the other, and he looked like a man who had just walked through fire and come out the other side not entirely whole. "Is it true?" she demanded before he even reached the stand. Her voice cracked on the words. Her hands, which had been arranging a bundle of sunflowers, stilled completely. "Tell me it is not true, Jude." He stopped 3 feet away from her. The street was busy. People moved around them like water around 2 stones. A wagon rolled past. Someone called out a greeting to the marshal from across the road. He did not acknowledge any of it. His gray eyes were fixed on her face with an intensity that made her chest ache. "Which part?" he asked quietly. "All of it," she whispered. "The warrant. What Calhoun said about you. What they are saying you did 5 years ago in Abilene. Tell me none of it is true, and I will believe you, Jude. I will believe you over every single person in this town." His jaw tightened. The fistful of wildflowers in his hand trembled slightly, and she realized his knuckles were white around the stems. "I cannot tell you none of it is true," he said. The bottom dropped out of her world. She had trusted this man. She had let this man inside every carefully constructed wall she had built around herself since her husband died, and left her alone with a flower stand and a rented room and nothing else. She had let Jude Keller make her laugh, make her feel safe, make her feel for the first time in 3 years, like the future might hold something warm. And now he was standing in front of her with someone else's flowers in his hand and a confession in his eyes, and she could not breathe. "Then you need to leave," she said. Her voice came out remarkably steady. She was proud of that, even as something inside her broke clean in two. He took 1 step toward her. "Nora, let me explain." "Leave," she said again, and this time her voice did not steady at all. He left. And she stood there behind her flower stand in the hot Kansas sun, surrounded by the smell of roses and lavender and sweet pea. And she thought about how it had all started 4 months ago, on a morning so ordinary that she had not known to pay attention to it until much later. The spring of 1882 came to Caldwell like an apology after a brutal winter. The town sat at the southern edge of Kansas, right on the edge of Indian Territory, and it had earned a reputation as one of the roughest cattle towns on the Kishome Trail. Cowboys poured through it every season, loud and reckless and desperate for something to spend their wages on. Gamblers and outlaws moved through it like shadows. There were 6 saloons on a single street, and the undertaker did a brisk business year-round. Into all of this, Nora Dalloway had planted flowers. Her stand occupied a small corner lot near the intersection of Main Street and 2nd Avenue, wedged between a hardware store and a feed shop. She had built the shelves herself, with wood salvaged from a demolished barn on the edge of town, and she had painted them white, which was an act of such stubborn optimism in a town like Caldwell that people had actually stopped to stare when she did it. She grew what she could in the small yard behind her rented room, and bought the rest from a farm 6 miles north. Sunflowers, roses, lavender bundles, sweet pea vines, Indian paintbrush, black-eyed Susans, bachelor buttons, and in the early spring, tiny fragile bunches of bluebells that she wrapped in brown paper and tied with twine. She had been doing this for 2 years. It was not a comfortable living, but it was hers. No one had given it to her. No one could take it from her. After everything she had lost, that mattered more than comfort. The morning Jude Keller first stopped at her stand was a Thursday in late April. She remembered because she had just received her first shipment of roses for the season, and she was elbow-deep in thorns, trying to strip the lower leaves from a dozen stems without cutting herself, which she was failing at comprehensively. She heard his boots first. The Marshal walked with a particular cadence, unhurried and deliberate, that she had come to recognize over 2 years of watching him move up and down Main Street. He was a tall man, broad through the shoulders, with dark hair going silver at the temples even though he could not have been more than 35. He had a scar along his jaw from some old violence that he never explained, and eyes the color of winter sky, pale gray and serious. He was not, by conventional measure, a handsome man. His face was too hard for that, too weathered, his nose crooked from being broken at least once. But he carried himself with a quiet authority that made people step aside for him without quite knowing why. She had spoken to him perhaps a dozen times in 2 years. He was not unfriendly, but he was not warm. He was the kind of man who occupied a room without filling it, whose presence registered without demanding attention. He stopped in front of her stand and looked at it for a moment with the same appraising expression he probably used when examining a crime scene. She waited. "Those are roses," he said finally. She looked up from the thorns. "They are," she said. "My deputy's wife is sick," he said. "She has been sick 3 weeks. He keeps forgetting to eat and forgetting to sleep, and I cannot get him to go home and rest." He paused. "I thought maybe if I brought her something, it would give him a reason to go visit her." Nora looked at him steadily. It was a long explanation for a simple purchase. She had the sense he was not a man who explained himself often, and that it was costing him something. "What does his wife like?" she asked. He blinked. "I do not know." "What color is her kitchen?" He stared. "I have no idea." "Is she a quiet sort of woman or a cheerful sort?" He thought about this seriously, which she appreciated. "Quiet," he said. "Steady. She has always seemed like someone who does not need a great deal of noise." "Then lavender," Nora said, and began putting together a bundle. "And some of these sweet peas. They smell lovely and they are not showy. They suit a steady woman." She wrapped them in brown paper and tied them with a length of pale ribbon and handed them across the counter. He took them with the careful deliberateness of a man handling something he was uncertain about. "How much?" he asked. 15 cents. He paid her. He looked at the bundle for a moment, then he looked at her. "Thank you," he said, and then, like it cost him something to add it, "Miss Dalloway." "Mrs.," she corrected automatically. Something shifted in his expression. "My apologies." "No need," she said. "He has been gone 3 years. I simply keep the title because it is easier than explaining." He nodded once, tucked the flowers carefully under his arm as though they were important documents, and walked away. She watched him go and thought nothing particular about it. He came back the following week. No explanation this time. He simply stood in front of the stand and looked at what she had, and she came around from the back where she had been repotting a geranium and waited for him to speak first, because she had already learned that he liked to come to things in his own time. "What are these called?" he asked, pointing at the Indian paintbrush. "Indian paintbrush," she said. "They grow wild all through this territory. I do not sell many of them. Most people want roses." "Why do you carry them if you do not sell many?" She considered the question. "Because they are beautiful and they belong here, and that seems like reason enough." He looked at her. Something in his face changed very slightly, and she could not read what it meant. "I will take a bunch," he said. "Who are they for?" she asked, mostly out of curiosity. "No one," he said. "I just want them." She sold him the Indian paintbrush for 10 cents, and he walked away with them, and she stood looking after him and thought that was a strange thing, for a man like that to buy flowers for no one. He came back a third time the week after that, and a fourth, and a fifth. By the sixth visit, she had started setting aside a small bunch of whatever came in freshest that week, just in case, and she did not examine this habit too closely, because examining it would have required acknowledging something she was not ready to acknowledge. They started talking. Not about anything significant at first. He asked her where she had grown up, and she told him Missouri, a small town near the border, and he said he had come through Missouri once, years ago. And she asked what had brought him to Caldwell, and he said work. The way a man says work when what he means is that he ran from one place until he found another where no one was asking questions. She recognized that answer because she had given it herself. By the third week of May, they had worked their way to longer conversations, the kind that started with a simple question and ended 20 minutes later with both of them slightly surprised at how much time had passed. He was dry and spare in his speech, not given to flowery language or excessive sentiment, but she had discovered that underneath all that compressed economy of expression was an actual mind, curious and observant and occasionally, unexpectedly, funny in a way that crept up on you before you knew it was there. She made him laugh once, accidentally, with a story about a rooster that had terrorized the neighbor's dog every morning for a week, and the sound of it stopped her completely. It was not a loud laugh. It was low and a little rusty, like a door that had not been opened in a long time, and it transformed his face entirely, took 10 years off it, and revealed something young and unguarded underneath all that weathered severity. She stared at him, and he immediately composed himself and went back to being Marshal Keller, and she thought, there is something buried in there that no one has bothered to dig for in a long time. She did not know why that thought made her want to cry a little. Her neighbor and closest friend in Caldwell was a woman named Mee Whitfield, who ran the boarding house 2 doors down from the flower stand, and who had an opinion about everything and the confidence to share it at any volume. Mee was 52 years old, originally from Tennessee, and had buried 2 husbands and raised 4 children to adulthood entirely by herself. She was the most formidably competent person Nora had ever met, and she loved her completely. Mee noticed the Marshal's visits within approximately 4 days. That man comes by more than any man I have ever seen who was not trying to court someone, she announced one evening while helping Nora sort lavender bundles. He just likes the flowers, Nora said. No man in Caldwell just likes the flowers, Mee said flatly. The cowboys buy them for the women at the saloon. The ranchers buy them because their wives send them with instructions. That man buys them because you are here. You are reading into it. Nora Dalloway, I have lived 52 years and buried 2 husbands, and I know when a man is working up to something. Mee paused. Do you like him? He is a decent man, Nora said carefully. That is not what I asked. Nora was quiet for a long moment. He unsettles me, she said finally. I am not sure what I think about being unsettled. Mee nodded slowly. Your husband unsettled you too at first. I remember you telling me. Thomas was different, Nora said, but she said it quietly and she did not look up from the lavender. Thomas Dalloway had been a good man, a kind man. He had loved her steadily and without drama for 6 years before the fever took him, and she had grieved him for 2 years, and then packed up everything they owned and moved to Caldwell, because she could not bear to stay in the town where every street corner held a ghost of him. She had built the flower stand because it was the one thing she knew how to do, the one skill she had carried intact through the shipwreck of loss. She had not expected to be unsettled again. She had not planned for it. Jude Keller was not what she would have chosen if she had been choosing. He was prickly and reserved, and he communicated in complete sentences only under mild duress. He wore his gun with the ease of a man who had used it more than he wanted to. He had a way of scanning every room and street he entered that suggested he had learned, at some point in the hard way, never to trust stillness. But he also brought his deputy flowers for a sick wife without being asked to. He asked questions and listened to the answers. He had held the Indian paintbrush carefully because he thought they were beautiful, and that seemed like reason enough. And something about that had gotten under her skin and refused to leave. In the last week of May, something changed between them. She had woken that morning with a terrible headache and the news, delivered by a breathless boy from the telegram office, that the farm north of town that she bought from had been damaged by a grass fire and would not be supplying her for at least 2 months. She had spent the first hour of the morning trying to work out how to manage without her primary supplier, and had ended up sitting on the edge of her stand, rubbing her temples, staring at her significantly depleted inventory with an expression that was trying very hard not to become tears. She heard the familiar cadence of his boots. She looked up. He stopped. He read her face with the same quiet precision he seemed to apply to everything, and did not ask if she was all right because she was obviously not, which she appreciated. "What happened?" he asked. She told him about the farm. She told him about the headache. She told him, with more exhaustion than she intended, about the 3 men who had come by the previous day demanding she lower her prices because, as one of them had put it, they did not see why they should pay full price to a woman on her own. Something in his expression went very still when she said that. "Which 3 men?" he asked. "It does not matter," she said. "I sent them away." "I know you did," he said. "Which 3 men?" she told him reluctantly, and he nodded once and said nothing else about it. 3 days later, all 3 of those men came to her stand separately and paid for flowers they clearly did not need and were excessively polite while doing it. She never asked him what he had said to them. He never told her. But she felt something shift in her chest when she thought about it. Something warm and slightly alarming that she filed carefully under gratitude and tried not to look at too directly. The following Saturday, without any particular occasion demanding it, he arrived at her stand at opening time and said, "I would like to take you to dinner if you are willing." She looked at him. He was standing very straight, his hat in his hand, and he looked like a man who had been practicing that sentence and was now committed to getting through it with his dignity intact. "Dinner," she repeated. "At the hotel restaurant," he said. "Saturday evening, 6 o'clock. If you are willing," he added again, as if she might not have heard it the first time. She should have said no. She had told herself on the 3 or 4 occasions when she had been forced to examine her feelings honestly that nothing could come of this. He was the marshal of a cattle town. He carried a gun. He had a past he would not speak of. She was a widow who had survived one love and had no particular desire to survive another one. "I am willing," she heard herself say. He put his hat back on. 6 o'clock, he said, as if confirming a business appointment. Then he turned and walked away, and she watched him go and thought, "Well, that is that then." He was at the hotel restaurant at 5 minutes to 6, which told her something. The restaurant was the most respectable eating establishment in Caldwell, which was not saying a great deal, but the tablecloths were clean and the food was genuinely good, and it was not the kind of place where cowboys got drunk and broke chairs. He had dressed in clean clothes, dark trousers and a white shirt without the badge, and she registered with a small jolt that without the badge he looked entirely different, less official and more simply like a man sitting at a table waiting for someone he wanted to see. She had worn her blue dress, the one she saved for occasions, with her dark hair pinned up, and a small bunch of sweet pea tucked into the collar because she was a woman who sold flowers and she had the option. He stood when she came in, pulled out her chair, did not comment on the flowers in her collar, but looked at them for a moment with something in his expression that she was starting to learn to read. "You are nervous," she said, because she had discovered that the most effective way to deal with his reticence was to simply name the thing he was not saying. He looked at her. "Somewhat," he admitted, which was more honesty than she had expected. "So am I," she said. Something in him seemed to ease slightly. They talked all the way through dinner, and then for an hour after over coffee, about everything and nothing. He told her he had grown up in Virginia, that his father had been a farmer, that he had come west after the war with a single change of clothes, and a significant number of things he was trying to put distance between himself and. She did not push on what those things were. She told him about growing up on the Missouri border, about her mother who had died when she was 12, and her father who had been a school teacher and the best man she had ever known until Thomas, and her father's extensive library of books which she had memorized more thoroughly than any formal education would have required. "What did you read?" he asked. "Everything," she said. "Dickens, Cooper, Homer, whatever my father could get his hands on. He believed that a mind without books was like a garden without water." She paused. "I believe that is where I got the flowers from, actually. He always said that tending something living was good for the soul." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her with that gray gaze that she had stopped finding unnerving somewhere in the middle of the soup course. "He sounds like a good man," he said. "He was," she said. "He died the year after Thomas. I lost them both within 14 months. She said it matter-of-factly because time had given her that, at least, the ability to speak of it without falling. "I decided after that I needed to be somewhere entirely new, somewhere nothing reminded me of anyone. So I came here. To a cattle town," he said, and there was something in his voice that was almost gentle. "To a cattle town," she agreed, "where I planted flowers." He looked at her for a long moment. "You are braver than you give yourself credit for," he said. It was said simply, without decoration, and it landed in her chest like a stone dropped in still water, sending ripples outward. She looked down at her coffee cup. "I do not know about brave," she said. "I simply did not have another option I was willing to take." "That is what brave is," he said. She looked up at him. He was watching her with an expression she could not entirely decode, something layered and careful, and underneath all of that, something that looked like wanting. She thought, "I am in a great deal of trouble." He walked her back to her rented room that night, because it was 10 o'clock and Caldwell's streets were not safe for a woman alone at that hour, even on a good night. They walked slowly, not touching, but close enough that she was acutely aware of the warmth of him beside her. At her door, he stopped and turned to her, and she could see him working through something, some internal negotiation. "I would like to do this again," he said. "So would I," she said, a pause. "Good," he said. She went inside before she did something she was not ready for, like reaching up and touching the scar along his jaw that she had been thinking about for the better part of an hour. June arrived, and with it, the kind of heat that made the cattle town smell considerably less romantic than it appeared from a distance. Nora managed her supply problem by writing to a farm 40 miles south and negotiating a new arrangement. And she expanded her stand slightly by adding a small table to the left side. She cut sunflowers every morning and brought them in buckets of water, and the whole corner smelled like summer and green things. Jude came every day now. Not always to buy flowers, though he did that too, often things he had no particular use for, like a single cornflower or a bunch of dill, which she had started carrying because a woman from the German settlement outside of town asked for it regularly. He bought them anyway. She thought he was doing it to help her business, and she was touched and annoyed in roughly equal measure. He was a man of extraordinary stubbornness. She discovered this gradually, the way you discover a large piece of furniture in a dark room, by running into it repeatedly. He had decided she was not to be troubled or pressured, and he had arranged the world accordingly. And she could not argue with it, because she never saw it happening directly. She just noticed that the 3 men who had harassed her never came back, that a 4th man who had made an unpleasant comment about her prices in late May subsequently had a long private conversation with the Marshal that he did not talk about afterward, and that the 2 cowboys who had leaned against her stand making noise until she was uncomfortable were suddenly very busy elsewhere every time they walked past her corner. She confronted him about it once. "You are managing things around me," she said. He looked at her with complete equanimity. "I am doing my job," he said. "Your job does not require you to appear every time someone says something rude to me. This town is my jurisdiction," he said. "Everyone in it is my responsibility." "Jude," she said. He met her eyes. "I do not like it when people give you trouble," he said quietly. "I realize that is not your problem, but there it is." She held his gaze for a long moment. "All right," she said finally, "but I am not made of glass." "I know that," he said. "You are probably the least breakable person in this town." She blinked. "That is the most words you have ever used to compliment me." "Do not get used to it," he said, which she was fairly certain was a joke. She was definitely in a great deal of trouble. They went to dinner a second time, and a third. He started meeting her when she closed the stand in the evenings and walking with her, not toward her room exactly, but along the quieter streets on the edge of town where you could hear crickets and see the last of the sunset over the prairie. They talked about books, which he had also read more of than she would have expected, and about the town, and about small things, and about nothing in particular. She learned him slowly, the way you learn a landscape by walking it repeatedly. He was not a man who performed warmth, but it was there underneath the reserve. She found it in the way he noticed everything about her, remembered things she had said in passing and referenced them weeks later. In the way he looked at her sometimes when he thought she was not watching with an expression so unguarded, it made her breath catch. "She told me about the dinners and the walks," Mee said. "I told you." "You did," Nora admitted. "Are you happy?" Mee asked. Nora thought about it carefully, the way she thought about most things. "I am afraid," she said, "but yes, I think underneath the fear I am quite happy." Mee patted her hand. "That is about as good as it gets," she said. "Let yourself have it." On a warm evening in late June, they were sitting on the steps of the empty church at the far end of 2nd Avenue, which was their unofficial destination when they wanted quiet. He had brought a bottle of sarsaparilla from the general store, which he had been doing occasionally, because she had mentioned once that she liked it. And they sat side by side watching the sun go down over the flatlands with the colors going orange, and then pink, and then deep purple across an enormous Kansas sky. She was telling him about a book she had been reading, something she had borrowed from the small circulating library that a woman named Mrs. Fletcher ran out of the back room of her millinery. He was listening with the focused attention he gave everything, occasionally asking a question. And she was aware in the warm summer air of exactly how close they were sitting, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm through the thin fabric of her sleeve. She stopped talking mid-sentence because she had lost the thread of it entirely. He looked at her. She looked at him. He reached up very slowly and tucked a strand of hair back from her face that had come loose from her pins. A gesture so quiet and tentative from a man who was otherwise so certain of everything he did that it undid her completely. And she leaned forward the 2 inches that separated them and kissed him. He went very still for a moment. Then he kissed her back, careful and steady, the way he did everything, and she felt the careful reserve in him crack open just slightly, the door that had been closed for a long time swinging an inch ajar. When they broke apart, he sat back and looked at the sunset for a moment. She could see the side of his face, jaw tight, and she wondered if she had overstepped. "I have been thinking about that for approximately 2 months," he said. She let out a breath that was almost a laugh. "Why did you not do anything about it?" "I was not sure you wanted it," he said. "I am not always easy to be with, Nora, I know that." "Neither am I," she said. He turned to look at her. "You are," he said. "You have no idea how easy you are to be with." She felt something warm and aching spread through her chest. "Do not say things like that to me, Jude Keller," she said, because she did not know what else to do with it. "All right," he said, but he was looking at her like he meant it absolutely. They sat on the church steps until the sky went dark and the stars came out enormous and bright over the prairie, and he held her hand loosely, and they did not need to say anything else. July came with relentless heat, and a cattle drive that brought 300 head of longhorns through the main street in a single morning, which was spectacular and terrifying, and involved her moving everything from the stand that could be startled by sudden noise. The cowboys who rode with the drive were raucous and celebrating, and several of them stopped to buy flowers, which pleased her, and several others attempted conversations she shut down with a look, which pleased Jude, who was managing the chaos from horseback and missed very little of what happened on his street even from that distance. He had a horse named Garrison, a dark bay with a white blaze that was significantly more charming than his owner and knew it. Nora had been introduced to Garrison in late June and had formed an immediate and mutual attachment, which she was aware annoyed Jude slightly in a way he would never acknowledge. "He never does that with anyone," he said one morning when Garrison pushed his nose into her shoulder while Jude was trying to give him directions. "He has better manners than you," she said. He looked at her with an expression that was trying very hard not to be a smile. She had become, without entirely planning it, a person in love. She turned the word over in her mind occasionally and looked at it from different angles, testing it, checking the weight of it. It was different from what she had felt for Thomas. Not lesser but different. Less peaceful and more electric, shot through with a kind of urgency that frightened and exhilarated her in equal measure. Thomas had been her first love, the kind that builds slowly and softly and holds a constant temperature. What was building with Jude was something with weather in it, with storms and sudden sunlight and the kind of quiet that comes after rain when everything smells new. She told him about Thomas more fully one evening in mid-July, because she thought he deserved to know. She sat on the church steps with him, and she told him about the fever, about the 16 days between the first sign of it and the morning she woke up a widow, about the particular silence of a house where someone is missing. She told him about the grief and about the long, slow climb back from it. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "I am sorry," he said. "Tell me about your past," she said, not to deflect but because she meant it. "Not the whole thing, just something real." He was quiet for a long time. "I made mistakes in my early years," he said finally. "I was not always on the right side of things. When I came west after the war, I was young and I was angry and I was not careful about who I worked for or what I did." He paused. "I took a job in Abilene in 1877 that I should not have taken. For a man I should not have worked for. I did things that kept me from sleeping well for a long time after." "What kind of things?" she asked. "Enforcement," he said, which was a word that covered a great deal. "I was hired muscle for a man who used intimidation to control his business interests. I told myself it was work, that I was just doing a job, but I knew better and I did it anyway." He looked at his hands. When I walked away from it, the man I had worked for made threats. I came here because I needed to be somewhere I could do the opposite of what I had been doing. Somewhere I could be useful instead of harmful. She looked at him. That was 5 years ago, she said. Yes. And you have been here 5 years keeping order in a cattle town. Yes. That seems like a significant effort to balance the accounts, she said quietly. He looked at her. Something in his expression was careful and vulnerable in a way she rarely saw. I did not know if it was enough, he said. I cannot tell you if it is enough, she said. But it matters. What you do here matters. I have seen you do it. She paused. The man you were 5 years ago would not have bought his deputy's sick wife lavender and sweet pea. Something moved across his face. No, he said softly. He would not have. She reached over and took his hand, and he held it in both of his, and they sat in the warm dark with the crickets singing and the stars enormous overhead, and she thought, I am going to love this man. I am already loving this man. I am simply still getting used to the size of it. Now came August, which was when the story came apart at its edges, when things that had been buried and distant arrived on Nora's doorstep in the form of a telegram, and a man named Gerald Calhoun. Calhoun arrived on a Monday. He was a lawyer from Wichita, lean and well-dressed in the specific way of men who want to be taken for more honest than they are. And he came with papers, and with the satisfied expression of someone who has been holding a secret for a long time and is finally getting to use it. He found Nora at her stand in the morning and introduced himself and said, with no preamble at all, I understand you are acquainted with the man who calls himself Jude Keller. I thought you might want to know some things about him before you become further acquainted. She looked at Calhoun and disliked him immediately. What things? She said carefully. He has a warrant outstanding from Abilene, Calhoun said, for his conduct in 1877. The man he worked for, one Wesley Harlan, was eventually arrested and charged, and the people who worked for him were named in the associated proceedings. Keller's name is on a warrant signed by a judge in Sedgwick County. The warrant was issued in 1879, but was never served because Keller made himself scarce. He paused for effect. I am here to see that it is served now. Why? She asked. Because Harlan is appealing his conviction, and his lawyers believe that finding Keller and compelling his testimony will support their case, Calhoun said. And because I am paid well to locate people who prefer not to be located. He tipped his hat and walked toward the marshal's office, and Nora stood behind her flower stand and felt the ground shift under her feet. The telegram arrived 20 minutes later. It was not for her. It was for the marshal, delivered by a boy who ran past her stand and down toward the office with the urgency of someone carrying something important. She knew about its contents only because Mee's nephew worked at the telegram office, and Mee told her everything. And what Mee told her was that the telegram was from a judge in Sedgwick County, and that it was about an outstanding warrant, and that it had specifically requested verification of Keller's presence in Caldwell. By the time Jude came to her stand that afternoon, she had had 6 hours to sit with the information, and the fear and the hurt and the sickening uncertainty had curdled into the kind of confrontation she had not planned on having. She had demanded, "Is it true?" And he had said he could not tell her none of it was true, and she had sent him away. She spent the rest of that afternoon in a state of barely controlled misery. She sold flowers mechanically to 3 customers and put their money in the cash box without counting it. Mee came by at 4 o'clock, took one look at her face, and pulled her into the back room behind the flower shelves where there were 2 wooden stools and a water bucket, and they could talk without being overhead. "Tell me," Mee said. She told her. Mee listened without interrupting, which was unusual for me. When Nora finished, Me was quiet for a moment. So he told you some of it was true, Me said. Yes. But you already knew some of it was true, Me said slowly. He told you himself in July, about Abilene. About working for a man he should not have worked for. Nora stopped. She had, in the shock of the morning, and the anger and the fear, genuinely not connected those two pieces of information. She had heard Calhoun's version and the confirmation, and not registered that she already had Jude's version, and that Jude's version had come from Jude himself, unprompted, on a summer evening when he had no reason to tell her except that he thought she deserved to know. "Oh," she said. "The question," Me said carefully, "is not whether he has a dark past. You knew that. The question is whether what he told you was true and whether the man he is now is the man you know, because those are not the same question." Nora sat very still. "He has a warrant," she said. "He does," Me agreed. "That is a serious thing." "It is," Me said. "But a warrant is a legal instrument, and legal instruments can be resolved. A character is a more permanent thing." She looked at Nora steadily. "You sent him away, honey, that is your right. But do not send him away for the wrong reason." Nora thought about this for a long time. The next morning, she went to the Marshal's office. She had never been inside it before. It was a plain room with a desk and a rifle rack and a locked cabinet and a small jail cell in the back that was currently empty. It smelled of gun, oil, and old coffee. Jude was at the desk when she came in, and he stood up immediately, and she could see from his face that he had not slept. "You knew about the warrant," she said. He looked at her. "Yes. For how long?" "I have known it was possible for years," he said. "I knew when Harlan was convicted in 1880 that there was a risk his lawyers would come for the people who had worked for him. I did not know the warrant had been issued until last month when I received word through a contact in Wichita." "And you did not tell me," she said. "No," he said. "I should have." "Yes," she said. "You should have." He sat down heavily, not at the desk but on the edge of it, which she recognized as a gesture of exhaustion. "I was afraid," he said. It came out with difficulty. "I was afraid that if I told you, I would lose this before I had managed to figure out what this was. That is not a good reason." "I know that." She stood in the middle of the room and looked at him. "The man you described to me in July," she said, "the one who took a job he should not have taken. What did he actually do? I need the full truth, Jude, not the softened version." He met her eyes. "He intimidated people. Used physical force on occasion. Helped a man who was using unfair business practices control property and people who owed him money." He paused. "He never killed anyone on Harlan's orders. That is not a proud distinction, but it is the truth. He walked away when Harlan asked him to escalate beyond that, and that walking away was what led Harlan to eventually make threats and what made Keller leave Abilene. And the warrant is for conspiracy, broadly defined. The lawyers think compelling my testimony will support Harlan's appeal argument that he was being represented by others without full authorization." He paused. "It is not entirely inaccurate. But Harlan's argument is that he was unaware of the most serious of his employees' actions, and I can testify to the truth of that, which is that Harlan was fully aware and directing it all personally." She looked at him for a long moment. "So your testimony would not help Harlan's appeal," she said slowly. "It would hurt it." "Yes," he said. "Then Calhoun is not here to help Harlan get justice. He is here to intimidate you into silence or flight so that you cannot testify against him." Something shifted in his expression. "When did you work that out?" "About halfway through last night," she said. "Me asked me the right question." He was looking at her now with something that was not quite hope and not quite despair, but some complicated mixture of both. "Nora," he began. "You should have told me," she said. I will not pretend that does not matter. You were afraid and you hid something from me, and I need you to understand that I cannot be with someone who does that, because I have built my entire life around being truthful with myself and with the people I care for, and I need the same in return." "I know," he said. "But," she said, and his whole body went still, "what Calhoun told me and what you told me in July are the same story from different angles. You told me first. That matters." He looked at her. The morning light came through the single window of the marshal's office and landed on his face, and she could see every tired line of it, and under all of it the same thing she had been seeing for months, something that was not just wanting but actual love, real and specific, and pointed directly at her. "What are you going to do about the warrant?" she asked. "Face it," he said. "I have been running from it for 5 years. I am done running. Will you need a lawyer?" "I will need to contact a lawyer in Wichita," he said, "and I will need to go there in person eventually. But I am not going anywhere until this town has a functioning replacement, which will take time to arrange through the county." "Then you have time to handle it properly," she said. "Yes," he said. She crossed the room and stood in front of him where he sat on the edge of the desk. He looked up at her. She put her hand flat on his chest over his sternum and felt his heartbeat under her palm, faster than it should have been for a man at rest, which told her everything she needed to know. "Do not hide things from me again," she said. "I will not," he said. "I mean it, Jude. If there is something, you tell me. I am not breakable." "I know," he said. "I am furious with you," she said. "I know that too," he said. "And I am not sending you away," she said. "Because I have looked very carefully at what I actually know about you and what I feel about you, and I am not sending you away." He reached up and covered her hand on his chest with his own. He did not say anything, which with him was an entire sentence. She stood like that for a moment. Then she said, "You look terrible, by the way." "I have not slept," he said. "I noticed." She pulled her hand back. "Come by the stand this afternoon. I have a new shipment of roses." He looked at her. That is all," she said. "For now." She left him there in the morning light of his office and walked back to her stand. And she thought about how love was not the absence of conflict but the willingness to stand in it and not leave. And she thought her father would have approved of that formulation. The situation with the warrant moved quickly once Jude decided to stop running from it. He wrote to a lawyer in Wichita, a man named Arthur Fenwick, who came highly recommended, and Fenwick's response, which arrived in 10 days, was cautiously optimistic. The warrant, Fenwick explained in careful legal language, was attached to Harlan's appeal proceedings, and Jude's voluntary cooperation as a witness for the prosecution would likely result in the warrant being dismissed. What Harlan's lawyers actually feared was not Jude's arrest, but Jude's testimony, which would directly contradict the narrative they were building. The warrant was a legal tool being used as intimidation. The way to defuse it was to walk into the Wichita courthouse and offer to tell the truth. Calhoun left Caldwell 3 days after he arrived, presumably because the mission of intimidation had not produced the flight response he was counting on. Jude watched him go from the doorway of the marshal's office with an expression Nora could not entirely read but which she thought contained considerable relief. In the last weeks of August, something settled between them. The crisis had shaken loose some remaining reserve, burned off the last of the careful politeness they had been performing around each other, and what remained was more honest and more real. They talked about the warrant and about Abilene, and about the choices he had made and the reasons he had made them. And she was direct and sometimes sharp, and he was truthful in a way she could see cost him something. And by the end of those conversations, she felt she knew him as thoroughly as she had ever known anyone. She knew he had grown up in a farmhouse in Western Virginia with 2 brothers and a father who worked himself to the bone, and a mother who read to all 3 boys every night until they were old enough to be embarrassed by it, at which point she had stopped, and he had subsequently read extensively on his own, which proved her point. She knew he had fought on the Union side of the war at the age of 17, and seen things that a 17-year-old should not see, and that some of what she read as hardness was simply the residue of that. She knew he had come west looking for simplicity and found complication instead, because the West was not a clean slate, but simply a different kind of mess. She knew that he was, at his core, a man who believed in doing right, who had failed that belief badly once and was spending years trying to pay the debt, and that the paying was real and not performance. She also knew that he was hopeless at small talk, made genuinely excellent biscuits when he could be prevailed upon to cook, was completely unable to resist giving Garrison extra apples, and that when he held her hand his grip was careful and warm and steady in a way that made her feel, for the first time since Thomas died, like she was standing on solid ground. In September, something happened that she had not expected, which was that Jude bought her entire flower stand, not the stand itself, the inventory, every single bunch and stem and bucket and pot she had on display on a Tuesday morning in the first week of September. All of it. She had been in the back sorting a new delivery when she came out to find him standing in front of her stand with his hat in his hand, and his deputy, a young man named Sam Worth, standing slightly behind him looking profoundly uncomfortable with the whole situation. "I would like to buy everything you have on display," Jude said. She stopped and stared at him. "Everything?" "Yes, Jude. That is 4 dozen roses and 2 dozen sunflowers and 3 pots of geraniums, and the lavender bundles and the sweet pea and the bucket of bachelor buttons and the cornflowers and the Indian paintbrush and the dill." "Yes." She looked at him very carefully. "Why?" He glanced at Sam Worth, who was studying the horizon with intense dedication, and then back at her. "Because yesterday you told me, Whitfield, that the past 4 months have been the first time since Thomas died that you felt genuinely happy," he said. "And me told her sister. And her sister told half the town, and I heard it from 3 separate people by this morning." He paused, "and I thought about that. About the fact that you told someone you were happy, and that I had some part in that, and that I have not done enough in my life to deserve that, but I intend to do more." He looked at the flowers and then at her. "And I wanted to do something that matched how I felt about that fact, and this is what I came up with." She looked at the stand full of flowers, then at him. "That is the most impractical thing you have ever done," she said. "Almost certainly," he agreed. "What are you going to do with 4 dozen roses and 3 pots of geraniums?" "I have not entirely worked that out," he said. "I thought Sam could take some to his wife." Sam Worth said, from the direction of the horizon, "My wife would love flowers." She looked at Jude. He was watching her with that steady gray gaze, and she could see underneath all of it everything he was not saying, which was that he loved her, and that the flowers were a gesture because he was a man who found grand statements difficult and action easier, and that he was standing here in front of half the town in the early morning doing something objectively foolish because she had been happy, and he wanted to mark that. She felt a smile start somewhere in the middle of her chest and work its way up, and there it was. The smile he had apparently bought an entire flower stand to produce. It broke open across her face, and she could not have stopped it if she had tried. And she saw something in his expression change completely, the careful reserve falling away entirely, replaced by something warm and naked and wholly unguarded. "How much?" he asked, voice slightly rougher than usual. She quoted him a price significantly below actual value, which he accepted. and Sam Worth took 24 roses and both pots of geraniums, looking relieved to have a purpose, and Jude stood in the middle of Main Street in Caldwell, Kansas, holding what remained of her flower inventory and looking at her. "Will you come to dinner tonight?" he asked. "Yes," she said. That evening at the hotel restaurant, over the same tablecloths and the same coffee, he told her he loved her. He said it plainly and directly, the way he said everything of consequence, without elaborate setup, without the circling preparation she might have expected. He just said it, his gray eyes on her face, his hands quiet on the table. She said, "I love you too, Jude." He reached across the table and took both her hands in his. They sat like that for a very long time, and the restaurant noise moved around them, and the Kansas heat settled outside, and the stars came out over the cattle town. And she thought about how love arrived in strange ways and at unexpected times, and that the important thing was not to close the door on it when it knocked. October came with cooling air and the end of the cattle season, and the town quieted as the last drives pushed north and the cowboys moved on. In the cooling weather, the flowers that did well were the late-season ones, asters and dahlias and the last of the chrysanthemums, and Nora rearranged the stand to showcase them against the white painted shelves and thought they looked like a painting of something. Jude made his trip to Wichita in the second week of October. He went with Arthur Fenwick, and he was gone for 5 days, which were the longest 5 days Nora had spent in some time, not because she was afraid of what would happen to the legal situation, but simply because she was accustomed to him now, to the specific weight of his presence in her days, and his absence was notable in the way an empty room is notable. He wrote her a letter from Wichita, which arrived 2 days into his absence. It was a short letter, as letters from Jude went, but it contained, buried in 2 paragraphs of factual update about the legal proceedings, a single sentence that she read 4 times. "I find that I would rather be on any given street in Caldwell than in any other city, which I attribute to the fact that Caldwell contains you." She folded the letter and kept it in her apron pocket for the rest of the day and did not analyze why. He came back on a Friday. The warrant, Fenwick had argued successfully, was an improper instrument serving private legal ends rather than public justice, and with Jude's signed commitment to testify as a prosecution witness against Harlan's appeal, the Sedgwick County judge had agreed to dismiss it pending final resolution of the Harlan appeal. The appeal itself was scheduled for hearing in December. Jude would go back in December to testify, but the warrant was gone, and with it, the last piece of the dark past that had been hovering over them. She was at the stand when he came back. She saw him coming down Main Street on Garrison, dusty from the road, and she had the somewhat undignified experience of needing very much to go to him immediately, which she managed to reduce to walking quickly to the edge of her stand. He dismounted and handed Garrison's reins to a boy who happened to be nearby and walked toward her, and she thought, there it is, the walk, the unhurried and deliberate walk of a man who has decided where he is going. He stopped in front of her. "I am back," he said. "I noticed," she said. He looked at her for a moment. Then he put his arms around her, very carefully, right there on Main Street, and she leaned into his chest and felt his chin rest on top of her head, and thought that this was the first time they had properly embraced, and that it was as steady and warm and solid as she had known it would be. "How did it go?" she asked. "Well," he said, still holding her. "Fenwick is excellent. The warrant is resolved." "Good," she said. "I received your letter," he said. She had written him a letter too, the second day of his absence, and she had been considerably less restrained than she usually allowed herself to be. She had told him, in writing, that she thought about his laugh, and the way he held the Indian paintbrush, and the evening on the church steps, and the morning in his office, and that she was enormously glad he had come to her stand that first Thursday in April, and that she intended to make sure he was glad of it too. "I read it 3 times," he said. "Only 3, she said. She felt rather than heard his low laugh, and it was still the best sound she knew. November and December moved through Caldwell with cold winds and frozen ground and the particular bleak beauty of the prairie in winter. The flower stand was quieter in the cold months. Most of Nora's growing done from the small greenhouse she had constructed behind her rented room with boards and salvaged glass, tending forced bulbs and winter herbs and the hardy plants that survived frost. She supplemented with dried lavender bundles and seed packets and decorative gourds, things that sold less but sold steadily. Jude built her a better greenhouse. He showed up one Saturday morning in November with lumber and a plan and Sam Worth, who was good with a hammer, and they spent the entire day building an extension on the back of her small garden, properly framed and glazed, twice the size of what she had before. She brought them hot coffee every 2 hours and did not offer to help because she could see that Jude needed to do this as he needed to do most things he felt strongly about, which was with his hands and with visible effort. When it was done, he walked her through it, ducking slightly because the doorway was low, and she stood in the smell of fresh lumber and cold glass and said, "This is the most practical thing you have ever done." "I thought balance was important," he said. She looked at him. He was dusty from the work, his shirt untucked, a smear of sawdust on his jaw, and he looked happier than she had ever seen him, loose-limbed and at ease in a way that his Marshal's posture usually prevented. She thought, there he is, the man under the armor. She had been seeing him gradually for months, and here he was in full. This man who was not easy and was not simple, but who was real down to his bones. She kissed him right there in the new greenhouse, which smelled like lumber and possibility. December brought the Harlan appeal hearing and Jude's second trip to Wichita, this time for 4 days. His testimony was given and received, Fenwick reported later by letter, with considerable impact on the proceedings. Wesley Harlan's appeal was denied. The man who had defined so much of what Jude had run from would remain in prison, and the chapter that had haunted him for 5 years was finally, fully closed. He came home from Wichita with the expression of a man who has put down something very heavy and discovered that he does not miss the weight of it. Christmas came to Caldwell modestly. The town dressed itself in whatever decoration it could muster, pine boughs from a wagon that came down from the north, candles in windows, the tinny sound of a piano through the walls of the saloon playing something that might have been a carol if you were generous about it. There was a church service that was attended by considerably more of the town than attended it any other time of year, and Mee Whitfield organized a Christmas dinner for the boarding house residents and their neighbors that went on until well past dark. Nora brought flowers to the Christmas dinner. Forced narcissus from the new greenhouse, white and clean smelling, and she put them in a jar in the center of Mee's table. And Mee said they were the most beautiful things she had seen in years, and Sam Worth's wife, Clara, who had recovered fully from her illness, said she had never smelled anything so lovely. Jude sat beside Nora at the table, and she leaned her shoulder against his at some point in the evening, and he put his hand over hers on the tablecloth and left it there, warm and steady, for the rest of the dinner. After, walking home through the cold December night, their breath visible in the dark, he stopped under the bare branches of the single cottonwood that grew on 2nd Avenue and said, "Nora, I want to ask you something." She stopped, looked at him in the dark. He was serious in the way he was when something mattered. "I want you to marry me," he said. "Not because it is what is expected, not because we have been together long enough that it seems like the natural step. Because I have spent 36 years being something other than at home in my own life. And then I walked up to a flower stand in April, and you told me about Indian paintbrush, and something changed, and I have not been able to change it back. And I do not want to change it back. I want to be wherever you are. I want to argue with you about books, and I want to watch you with flowers, and I want to wake up in the same house as you every morning for the rest of my life. I want to make a home. He stopped. In the cold dark, she could see his breath and the careful gravity of his face. "If you are willing," he said, which made her chest ache. She looked at him for a long moment. "I am willing," she said. He put his arms around her in the cold December night, and she held him and thought, "Here is solid ground. Here is the home that is a person, not a place. Here is the thing worth tending." They were married in March of 1883, when the grass was coming back and the prairie was beginning to show green again. The ceremony was in the church on 2nd Avenue, which Nora found appropriate, and Whitfield cried loudly and without apology throughout the entire thing, which made Sam Worth, standing as Jude's witness, suppress a grin with visible effort. Nora wore her blue dress and fresh flowers in her hair, sweet pea and small white narcissus, and she walked to the front of the church and found Jude standing there looking at her with an expression so entirely unguarded and full of warmth that she had to take a breath before she could speak her vows, because she wanted to remember the exact quality of that look for the rest of her life. He said his vows plainly and directly, as he said everything without wavering, his eyes on her face. She said hers and meant every syllable. Afterward, at the small reception in the church hall, someone played a fiddle and there was dancing, and Jude danced with her exactly once, slowly, moving in a way that was not graceful but was wholly earnest, and he held her like she was something he had found and intended to keep. They moved into a house 3 streets from the flower stand at the end of March. It was a modest house, wood-framed, 2 stories, with a kitchen that got morning light and a back garden that was sufficient for Nora's purposes, and a front porch where she intended to put a rocking chair, which she did within a week of moving in. Jude built her a larger greenhouse in the back garden over 2 Saturdays, bigger and better than the first one, fitted with real glass panels he had ordered from a supplier in Kansas City. She transferred her growing operations to the new greenhouse with the focused satisfaction of a person given a proper tool for the first time, and the flower stand benefited immediately. By summer of 1883, she had doubled her inventory and started supplying cut flowers to 2 hotels and the restaurant and the millinery, which helped her negotiate because knew everyone and negotiated like a woman who did not consider no a final answer. Life settled into the shape they were building for it, which was not dramatic every day but was good, substantially and consistently good, which Nora thought was the most one could honestly hope for, and perhaps more than most people got. Jude continued as Marshal. His relationship with Caldwell had always been professional and slightly removed, but marriage changed something about how he occupied the town. He was still the Marshal, still wearing the badge and the gun and carrying the authority, but there was something easier in him now, something that showed in small ways, a shorter route to a laugh, a willingness to sit on the front porch in the evenings with Nora and let the day come to an end without scanning the street. He was still not a simple man. He was still prickly and spare with words and constitutionally unable to receive a compliment without immediately deflecting it. He still woke from bad dreams occasionally and lay quiet in the dark working through them, and she had learned not to make it a conversation unless he wanted one, and to put her hand on his arm in the dark to let him know she was there, which seemed to be what he needed. She was not a simple woman. She was stubborn and self-sufficient in ways that occasionally made partnership difficult, because she had built the habit of managing alone, and it did not dissolve overnight. She sometimes made decisions about the business that she should have discussed, and she sometimes carried worries for days before saying them aloud, because she had trained herself to manage her own troubles and untrained only slowly. But they were honest with each other. That was the foundation. They had established it in October with a confrontation and a letter and a promise, and they maintained it as deliberately as she maintained her greenhouse, which was to say with consistent attention and a willingness to address problems before they became crises. In the spring of 1884, 2 years after Nora had set up her flower stand on that Caldwell corner, and a year after she and Jude had stood in the church on 2nd Avenue and promised each other everything, she told him she was expecting a baby. He went very still when she told him. They were in the kitchen, morning light coming through the window, and she had said it plainly, as she said everything, watching his face. He stood for a moment with a cup of coffee in his hand and looked at her, and she could see something moving through his expression that she could not entirely name, something that was wonder and terror in approximately equal measure. "Are you all right?" he asked. The first thing he said. Not anything about himself or what it meant or what they would do. The first thing was, "Are you all right?" She felt something expand in her chest. "I am very all right," she said. He set the coffee cup down and crossed the kitchen and held her carefully, and she heard him exhale slowly against her hair. "Good," he said. "That is good." He was, she discovered over the following months, quietly and systematically extraordinary about all of it. He said very little that was overtly emotional about it, because he was Jude and that was not his mode, but his actions were a continuous translation of what his words did not say. He rearranged the house to make it easier for her, added a railing on the back steps without being asked, started waking earlier to take care of tasks she had been doing, not in a manner that treated her as an invalid, because he knew better than to suggest she needed managing, but in the small practical way of a man making adjustments. Sam Worth, whose wife Clara was expecting at the same time, told Jude he was managing it better than any first-time father Sam had encountered, and Jude said he was simply following instructions, which was his way of acknowledging that Nora had explained exactly what was helpful and what was not, and he had listened carefully, which she thought was perhaps the whole of the secret. Their son was born in November of 1884, in the upstairs room of the house on the quiet street, 3 blocks from the flower stand. He arrived in the early hours of the morning during a cold, clear night, and me was there and Clara Worth was there, and Jude was downstairs pacing a line into the kitchen floor, which Sam Worth was present for, and which he described to 3 different people afterward as the only time he had seen the Marshal look something other than composed. The baby was healthy. Nora was fine. When me brought Jude upstairs, he came into the room with the careful step of a man who has been frightened and is now adjusting to the relief, and he sat on the edge of the bed, and Nora put the wrapped bundle of their son into his arms and watched his face change. She had thought she had seen all of his expressions by now. She had been wrong. He held the baby with great care and absolute stillness, and looked at him with something she did not have a word for, because it was entirely new, something clean and enormous and holy, without the reserve she associated with him, as if this was a thing that had bypassed all his defenses entirely and arrived directly at the center of him. "Hello," he said to the baby quietly. The baby made a small sound. "That is high-quality communication for someone 12 minutes old," Nora said. He looked up at her with that expression, still without defenses, and said, "What do you want to call him?" They had talked about names but not settled. "You choose," she said. "You have been thinking about it, I can see it." He thought for a moment. "Henry," he said, "for your father." She felt her eyes fill. Her father, the schoolteacher from Missouri with his library of books and his belief in tending living things. Henry Dalloway, who had given her everything she knew about growth and patience and love. "Henry," she said. "Yes." Henry James Keller came into the world in November 1884 in Caldwell, Kansas, and announced himself with considerable enthusiasm for the first 6 weeks, which was followed by a slightly more manageable period during which he developed opinions about everything and expressed them at volume. He had his father's gray eyes and his mother's dark hair, and the temperament of someone who had decided very early that the world was intensely interesting, and he intended to examine all of it thoroughly. He was a curious, alert, sociable baby, and Nora, who had feared in her quieter moments that she might not be entirely suited for motherhood, discovered with relief and something like joy that she was rather good at it, and that she liked this small person with an intensity that was new and absolute and different from everything else she loved. Jude was, as a father, not what anyone who knew him only as Marshal Keller would have predicted. He was patient. He was present. He talked to Henry in exactly the same direct, unhurried way he talked to everyone, which Henry seemed to find calming, and he held him with the same careful steadiness he applied to everything he did. He read to him from the beginning, from the books on the shelf in the parlor, and if the books were occasionally more adult than strictly appropriate for an infant, Nora chose not to comment on it because Henry clearly enjoyed the sound of his father's voice, and the subject matter seemed secondary. She returned to the flower stand in the spring of 1885, with Henry in a basket behind the counter, and me checking in every few hours on the mornings Jude was on duty. The stand had continued through the winter under the management of a young woman Nora had hired the previous year, a girl named Eleanor Briggs, who had arrived in Caldwell with her family from Ohio, and who had a genuine aptitude for plants that Nora was glad to nurture. Eleanor stayed on, which meant Nora had help for the first time, and the business grew in the way businesses grow when they have 2 people's energy instead of 1. By the summer of 1885, they were supplying flowers to every respectable establishment in Caldwell, and had started a small mail-order seed catalog that Nora had designed herself, and that me had helped her distribute. Life was full and complex and demanding and genuinely happy, which was not the same as easy, and Nora understood the distinction and appreciated it. There were hard weeks and cold winters and difficult customers, and the ordinary frictions of a marriage between 2 stubborn, independent people. There were nights when Jude came home from something he had dealt with in his work, and sat at the kitchen table with the specific silence of a man carrying something heavy, and she sat with him and did not push, and eventually he talked or he did not, and either way she was there. There were mornings when she was tired and overwhelmed and worried about the business and the money and the future, and he would put his hands on her shoulders and say something characteristically dry and practical that somehow made the weight of it manageable. They argued occasionally, genuinely, about real things, and they came through the arguments, and coming through them made the foundation more solid, not less. The way wood is stronger for having been seasoned. Henry took his first steps in January of 1886, at 14 months, directly toward his father, who was sitting on the kitchen floor with his back against the cabinet because Henry had found that entirely accessible and had decided it was the correct way to spend a morning. Henry walked 3 steps and sat down hard and looked up at Jude with an expression of great personal satisfaction, and Jude looked at him with that same undefended expression and said, "Well done." It was, Nora thought, the best conversation she had ever witnessed. In the spring of 1887, she found herself expecting again. She told Jude in the kitchen again, morning light through the window again, and this time he did not go still. He crossed the kitchen immediately and put his arms around her, and she laughed into his shoulder because she had known he would do exactly that. Their daughter was born in October of 1887, small and dark-haired and so immediately sure of herself that Nora thought she was her own mother's daughter in the most complete possible way. They named her Rose, which Nora chose and Jude accepted with the expression of a man who found it both obvious and perfect. Henry, who was 2.5, greeted his sister with a thorough inspection followed by a question. "Is she staying?" And when told yes, said, "All right then," and went back to whatever he had been doing, which Nora thought was about the most reasonable response available. Rose grew into a person of strong opinions and considerable energy, which was a challenge and a delight in roughly equal measure. She had her father's seriousness, and her mother's stubbornness, and the specific charm of someone who had worked out very early that being the second child meant you could get away with more. Jude, who managed outlaws and cattle drives and the general chaos of a lawless frontier town with professional equanimity, was entirely managed by Rose, who called him Papa, and had discovered at the age of 2 that she could accomplish this by the simple method of putting her arms up and looking at him, at which point he would put down whatever he was doing and pick her up, which Nora pointed out to him, and which he denied with what she thought was inadequate sincerity. "She has you completely," Nora said. "I do not know what you are talking about," he said. "You just put down a formal report to pick up a toddler who was perfectly content until she saw that she could get you to pick her up." He looked at Rose, who was sitting in his arms looking very pleased with herself. "She was not content," he said. "She looked uncertain." "She looked calculating," Nora said. "She is too," he said. "I know," Nora said. "I am telling you she is calculating at 2. He looked at his daughter. Rose patted his cheek. His expression went entirely soft. "She gets it from you," he said. Nora laughed, and he looked at her over Rose's head with that same expression, the one without armor, the one he reserved for the people in this house, and she thought, "This is what I could not have imagined when I planted flowers in a cattle town. This specific, ordinary, miraculous life." Caldwell changed over the years, as frontier towns did. The cattle drives peaked and then declined as the railroads pushed further west and south, and the fencing of range land changed the economics of the open drive. The wildness that had defined it in the early years became something more settled, more ordinary, as families put down roots and buildings went up in brick instead of wood, and the streets developed a more permanent character. Jude served as Marshal for 7 years total, through 1889, when he recommended Sam Worth as his successor to the county commissioners, and was appointed instead to the position of county judge, which surprised many people, though not Nora, who had watched him apply law with unusual precision and fairness for years, and thought the courtroom was the logical destination. He was a good judge. He was fair and unintimidated, and he understood exactly what legal power was for, which was the protection of people who needed protecting, and he applied it accordingly and without exception. Nora's flower business became, by 1890, the most successful enterprise of its kind in southern Kansas. She had expanded the stand twice, employed Alina Briggs full-time and a second assistant 3 days a week, and the seed catalog had grown into a genuine mail-order business that reached across 4 states. She had built something real and substantial from the salvaged wood and stubborn optimism she had started with, and she felt about it the way she felt about most of the important things in her life. grateful and proud, and somewhat amazed. Henry grew into a boy who read everything he could find, which did not surprise anyone, and who had his grandfather's name and his grandfather's belief that the world was worth understanding thoroughly. He helped in the flower stand on weekends and had a genuine gift for talking to customers, which he got from neither of his parents and which both of them acknowledged with transparent admiration. Rose grew into a girl who ran everywhere and negotiated for everything, and had the most comprehensive knowledge of every plant in her mother's greenhouse that could be acquired by the age of 5 by a person who asked approximately 40 questions per hour. On an evening in the spring of 1891, 9 years after a Thursday in April when a man had stopped at a flower stand and asked what Indian paintbrush was called, Nora was sitting on the front porch of the house on the quiet street, a cup of tea in her hand, watching the last of the April light go gold over the rooftops. The greenhouse behind the house was full of new growth. The flower stand down the street had its window boxes in. The cottonwood on 2nd Avenue was coming into leaf. Jude came out of the front door and sat down in the other rocking chair, and Henry came out behind him with a book, which he settled with on the top porch step. And Rose came out last and immediately announced that she needed to check on the primroses, which she had been tending with focus bordering on anxiety, and disappeared around the side of the house. Nora looked at Jude, he looked at her. "You know what today is?" she asked, he thought. "Thursday," he said. "A Thursday in April," she said. He was quiet for a moment, and she saw him work backward through 9 years to the first Thursday in April, the one at the flower stand. 9 years, he said. 9 years, she agreed. He reached across the space between the rocking chairs and took her hand. "You told me about Indian paintbrush," he said. "You bought a bunch for no one," she said. "Just because they were beautiful, they were," he said. He looked at her. "You were," she squeezed his hand. "Very good," she said. "You have gotten better at saying things." "I have had 9 years of practice," he said. Henry, on the step, turned a page without looking up. "Could you two be romantic somewhere I am not sitting?" he said, with the vast suffering dignity of a 9-year-old. Jude looked at his son. "Go check on your sister," he said. "She does not need checking on," Henry said. "She is talking to the plants." "Let her," Nora said. "It helps them grow." Henry looked skeptical of this, but closed his book and went around the side of the house. And Jude and Nora were left alone on the front porch with the April evening all around them. The smell of spring and growing things drifting from the greenhouse, the sound of the town settling into dusk, and the specific, comfortable warmth of two people who have chosen each other fully and kept choosing over all the ordinary days. She had built something from loss and from stubbornness and from the belief that tending something living was good for the soul. She had built a business and a life, and, unexpectedly and entirely by accident, and by the deliberate choice she had made every day since, a love that was not peaceful in the simple sense but was deep and real and rooted, the kind that held through weather because it had been through weather and had not broken. He was still prickly and reserved and communicated in complete sentences only under mild duress. She was still stubborn and self-sufficient in ways that were occasionally infuriating. They were not, in the end, particularly easy people. But they were honest and they were present, and they had built on that foundation something that was genuinely home. "Next year will be 10 years, she said. "It will," he said. "I think we should do something to mark it." He considered this. "What did you have in mind?" "I have not decided yet," she said, "but something with flowers." He looked at her. The expression without armor, the warm, unguarded one, the one he had been showing her for 9 years on the occasions when he forgot to lock the door, or when the moment was large enough that the door opened of its own accord. "I think we can manage that," he said. She thought about the flower stand in the beginning, the white-painted shelves in the roughest cattle town on the Kishom Trail, the stubbornness of it, the optimism that people had stopped to stare at. She had been right about the optimism, she thought. It was not naive to plant flowers in difficult ground. It was the most honest thing you could do, to put something beautiful in a place that needed it, to tend it carefully and defend it and give it water and sunlight and time. It grew.